The hum of the Rolls-Royce Phantom was a soothing lullaby, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of Charleston's bustling downtown. Inside, Eleanor Vance, CEO of Vance Capital, tapped a manicured finger against the sleek surface of her tablet. Her eyes, usually sharp and laser-focused on market trends and quarterly reports, were now veiled by a memory that had haunted her for decades. It wasn't the hum of the engine she heard, but a faint crackling phone line, an echo of a distant sob, and the hollow dismissive words that had once crushed a dream. They wouldn't give her a dime. Eleanor glanced out the tinted window, her gaze landing on the gleaming facade of Regal Reserve Bank. Its grand neoclassical architecture, all imposing columns and polished marble, spoke volumes of old money-established power, and an unspoken exclusivity that still clung to the very air around it. For Eleanor, however, it was more than just a financial institution. It was a monument to a painful past, a silent witness to a moment of profound injustice that had irrevocably shaped her family's destiny. 40 years ago, this very building, then known as Southern Trust and Loan, had been the stage for her grandmother's quiet heartbreak. Alara Mae Johnson. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing her a woman of quiet strength, hands calloused from years of baking, eyes sparkling with a dream that felt both audacious and deeply rooted. Alara Mae wasn't asking for handouts. She was seeking a loan to expand her small beloved bakery in the heart of the historically Black community of North Charleston. Her Dream Loaf Bakery wasn't just a business. It was a gathering place, a sanctuary where the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the laughter and camaraderie of a community often overlooked. Alara Mae had meticulously prepared her business plan. Every number crunched, every recipe perfected. Every hope poured into neat handwritten pages. She remembered the story her grandmother, always a storyteller herself, had recounted with a forced cheerfulness that barely masked the sting. Alara Mae, dressed in her Sunday best, had walked into Southern Trust and Loan, her worn purse clutched tight, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She was directed to a stern-faced loan officer, a man named Mr. Sterling, whose spectacles seemed to magnify his disdain. "Are you sure this venture is sustainable for someone from your neighborhood, Ms. Johnson?" He had intoned his voice, dripping with condescension. He'd picked apart her plan, questioned her capabilities, and subjected her to an almost comical barrage of excessive paperwork that no one else seemed to require. "We simply can't approve this at this time," he concluded, pushing the thick stack of papers back across the desk, never once meeting her eyes. The dream baked into every page had crumbled into dust. Alara Mae had left that bank not just with an empty purse, but with a piece of her spirit diminished, a subtle, invisible scar left by the systemic bias of a society that subtly, relentlessly told people like her they weren't worthy. That no had echoed through generations. Eleanor, even as a child, understood its weight. It fueled a quiet fire within her. She didn't just want success. She wanted something more profound. She wanted to build a financial fortress, a bastion of power, so that no one in her family or her community would ever again be subjected to such indignity. The path wasn't easy. As a young Black woman venturing into the cutthroat world of finance, Eleanor had faced her own share of Mr. Sterling's. She encountered raised eyebrows, subtly closed doors, and the constant exhausting need to prove herself not just once, but every single day. But with every challenge, Alara Mae's quiet resilience, her unwavering dignity, became Eleanor's own. She built Vance Capital from a tiny rented office fueled by fierce intelligence and an unshakable belief that financial power could and should be wielded for justice. And now, here she was. The Rolls-Royce glided to a stop. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had conquered Wall Street, had just quietly acquired Regal Reserve Bank, the very institution that had once denied her grandmother. It wasn't just a strategic business move. It was a profound act of reclaiming a dismantling of a symbol of entrenched injustice from within. This was her silent vow to Alara Mae, a promise whispered across decades. This time, it would be different. But a true leader didn't just sign papers and issue commands from on high. Eleanor believed you couldn't truly fix a broken system from a spreadsheet. You had to feel the splinters of its cracks, witness its flaws firsthand. She needed to experience the subtle, insidious forms of discrimination that often went unreported, the microaggressions that formed the invisible walls. So today, Eleanor Vance, the CEO, was stepping into Regal Reserve not as its new owner, but as Eleanor Johnson, a plain, unassuming customer simply looking for a new bank. This wasn't just a transaction, it was a reckoning. She drew a deep breath, her eyes hardening with resolve. She was ready to peel back the layers, ready to face the truth no matter how ugly. And the next step would take her right through those gleaming doors into the heart of the very system she was determined to change. Eleanor pushed open the heavy glass doors of Regal Reserve, stepping from the humid Charleston air into the cool, climate-controlled grandeur of the bank lobby. She was dressed meticulously for the part, a simple, well-worn linen dress, comfortable flats, and a nondescript canvas tote bag instead of her usual designer leather. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the financial titan. She was Eleanor Johnson, an ordinary citizen. And almost immediately, she became invisible. A young, eager-looking white couple who had entered just after her were instantly greeted by a smiling concierge and escorted to a plush seating area. Eleanor, meanwhile, stood patiently, then took a number and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. She observed the bustling activity, the polite smiles exchanged with other patrons, the swiftness with which certain customers were ushered to a teller or a private office. When her number was finally called, it was by a voice that sounded vaguely bored, emanating from behind the customer service sign. Next, Eleanor approached the desk where a man with slicked back hair and an overly enthusiastic tie, David Trafford, sat poised. He offered a practiced, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How can I help you today?" he asked, already typing on his keyboard, not quite looking at her. "Good morning." Eleanor began, her voice calm, polite. "I'm interested in learning more about opening a checking account. I prefer to speak with someone in person." David Trafford paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over her modest attire before settling briefly on her face. "Ah, yes, a checking account," he said, his smile tightening. "Well, for something as simple as that, our digital services are much more efficient for your needs. You can easily apply online or even use our ATM for most basic transactions. It saves you a trip." He gestured vaguely towards a row of gleaming impersonal machines. "It's all quite straightforward." Eleanor felt a familiar prickle of annoyance, a sensation she hadn't permitted herself to feel in years. It was the same subtle dismissal her grandmother must have felt, the assumption of tech illiteracy, the gentle steering towards automated services despite her stated preference for human interaction. She saw a young white woman a few desks down, laughing comfortably with a teller as she withdrew cash. No mention of ATMs or digital efficiency. "I understand, but I'd really prefer to speak with someone about the different options," Eleanor insisted, her voice unwavering. "I have a few specific questions." David Trafford sighed a barely perceptible exhalation before reluctantly printing out a brochure and giving her directions to a different line. The invisible walls, she noted, were already standing. She returned 2 days later for her second encounter, this time with a seemingly straightforward goal: opening a basic savings account. She was directed to a different cubicle where Brenda Lewis, a woman with a tightly pulled-back ponytail and an air of detached efficiency, sat waiting. Brenda's politeness was almost chilling in its robotic precision. "Certainly, Ms. Johnson," Brenda said, her voice flat. "We'll just need a few things from you." What followed was a bureaucratic maze designed, it seemed, to deter. "We'll need 2 forms of government-issued ID, Ms. Johnson. Your driver's license and your passport, perhaps, or a state ID card." Eleanor presented her license and a utility bill, and proof of address, a recent utility bill or rental agreement, and a current income statement, of course. Eleanor provided bank statements from another institution, deliberately not Vance Capital. And finally, Brenda added, her eyes scanning a checklist, a letter of recommendation from your previous financial institution confirming your good standing. Eleanor felt a jolt. a letter of recommendation for a basic savings account. This was an unheard-of requirement, a flimsy veil over an unspoken policy. She had heard of such tactics designed to create insurmountable hurdles for certain demographics. It wasn't overt racism, not the shouted slur or the direct refusal. It was far more insidious, a suffocating blanket of paperwork, 1,000 tiny obstacles designed to make you give up, to feel unwelcome, to just go away. The effect was clear exhaustion, frustration, and the crushing realization that despite her preparations, the system was designed to keep her out. She thought of the sleek, expensive watches on the wrists of white customers she'd observed earlier, their simple transactions handled with smiles and minimal fuss. They were never asked for a letter of recommendation. Eleanor maintained her composure, her face a mask of polite inquiry. Internally, a storm brewed. Her grandmother hadn't just been denied. She had been subtly, systematically pushed out, made to feel small and undeserving. This was it, playing out all over again, just dressed in fancier clothes. Later that evening, after a long day of navigating corporate politics by day and subtle systemic roadblocks by afternoon, Eleanor called her son David Jr. His voice, usually brimming with youthful idealism, crackled with barely contained frustration. "Mom, you need to go public with this. Expose them. Power isn't given, it's taken." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a deep sigh escaping her lips. "Public shaming is a bandage, David," she said, her voice softer yet firm. "It might draw blood, but it won't heal the wound. I need a cure. I need to understand how the rot spread so I can cauterize it at the source. And to do that, I need to see it, feel it, taste it myself." She knew this was a dangerous game, one that required patience and absolute calm. But she also knew that some wounds ran too deep for mere bandages. They needed a surgeon's precision. Eleanor hung up her resolve, hardening. They wanted a reaction. They would get a revolution quietly at first. But tomorrow she would return. And this time she would push not just for answers, but for a confrontation. She would step right into the heart of the storm, ready for whatever they threw at her, because she knew deep down that the breaking point was coming. And she would be ready. Eleanor returned to Regal Reserve on the third day, the chill of the morning air doing little to calm the quiet intensity thrumming beneath her skin. This visit wasn't about opening an account. It was about confronting the absurd discriminatory requirements Brenda Lewis had imposed. She needed to push, to test the boundaries, to truly see how far the system would go before it broke. She approached the customer service desk, her eyes scanning for Brenda, but it was David Trafford she saw. He was standing by the desk, seemingly in mid-conversation with a junior employee, his face already etched with an exasperated frown. He looked up, and his eyes, which had barely registered her presence 2 days prior, now narrowed into a glare of recognition. Eleanor's simple attire and calm demeanor, instead of reassuring him, seemed to ignite a spark of irritation. To him, she wasn't a potential customer. She was a recurring nuisance, a problem that refused to disappear. "Well, if it isn't Ms. Johnson," he drawled, his voice laced with a thinly veiled condescension that scraped against Eleanor's composure. He dismissed the junior employee with a flick of his wrist. "Still having trouble with our very straightforward procedures?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Trafford, I'm here to follow up on the requirements for my savings account. I was asked for a letter of recommendation from a previous bank. I find that an unusual and frankly an unreasonable demand for a basic account." Her voice was even, but each word was a carefully aimed arrow. David Trafford's forced smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Unreasonable Ms. Johnson, at Regal Reserve, we maintain certain standards." He emphasized his gaze, sweeping over her with a dismissive air. "Perhaps you're accustomed to other, less rigorous institutions. Our policies are designed to protect our clientele." He practically spat the words clientele, implying she was clearly not one of them. The tension in the air thickened palpable enough to make other customers at nearby desks subtly turn their heads. "My standing as a client is impeccable," Eleanor stated, her voice lowering slightly, gaining a dangerous edge that only those who truly knew Eleanor Vance would recognize. "Perhaps the issue isn't my understanding of your procedures, but your understanding of fair banking practices." That was it, That was the spark that ignited David Trafford's tightly wound arrogance. His face flushed a deep red. "Listen, lady," he hissed, leaning over the counter, his voice rising. "I've had enough of your attitude. We don't serve your kind of trouble here. You either comply with our rules or you leave this bank now." Eleanor stood her ground, her body perfectly still, radiating a quiet defiance that only infuriated him further. His eyes darted around the busy lobby, seeking affirmation, needing to assert his diminishing authority. He saw the subtle glances, the hushed whispers, and in his inflated ego, he misread it all as judgment against him. He needed to make an example. "I've already called the police," he shouted, his voice echoing through the marble-floored lobby, bouncing off the high ceilings. "We don't serve your kind here." His hand trembling with fury, and a twisted sense of righteousness flew back, and then forward. Smack! The sound of the slap echoed through the grand space, sharp and jarring. A collective gasp rippled through the bank. Customers froze mid-transaction, heads turning towards the commotion. Eleanor Vance stood perfectly still, her cheek stinging from the impact, a burning red handprint already forming on her dark skin. Her eyes, however, never left the face of the man who had just struck her. Preston Reed, customer service manager, his name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights, stood panting, a look of shocked triumph on his face. Before anyone could fully process the scene, 2 security guards rushed over. Not to restrain David Trafford, who had just committed an assault. No, they converged on Eleanor. "You're under arrest, ma'am," one guard declared, his voice gruff, his hand reaching for her arm. "Disturbing the peace. We need you to come with us." Phones instantly came out. Bystanders began recording what was unfolding before them. Another viral moment of discrimination in America playing out in real time. Some looked uncomfortable, their eyes wide with disbelief and discomfort. Others were simply curious, morbidly fascinated by the unfolding drama. But most simply watched in silence, unwilling to involve themselves to cross the invisible line of confrontation. Eleanor felt the sting on her cheek, a physical echo of the systemic blows her community had absorbed for generations. But it wasn't just physical pain. It was the crushing weight of history, of humiliation, of having her dignity stripped away in public. Yet in that searing moment, a profound stillness settled over her. This wasn't just a moment of personal assault. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of the system she had come to unmask. The anger that had simmered for decades for Alara May, for every single person who had been made to feel less than solidified into an unshakable resolve. She didn't feel humiliation. She felt a cold, hard clarity. They had shown her their true colors. And now, it was her turn. Instead of responding with anger or fleeing in humiliation, Eleanor straightened her posture, adjusted the simple cardigan she wore over her plain blouse, and spoke. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the tense silence, carrying the unmistakable quiet confidence of someone utterly unaccustomed to being questioned, let alone assaulted. "I believe there's been a profound misunderstanding," she said, each word measured and calm, delivered with an almost ethereal composure, despite the angry red handprint forming on her dark skin. She looked directly at the bewildered security guards, then back at David Trafford, whose self-satisfied smirk was slowly, imperceptibly beginning to falter. Before they could move to physically restrain her, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Before we proceed, I simply ask to speak with the ranking officer. There's something they will need to understand." The stage was set. The trap was sprung. And the true unveiling was about to begin. The police officer, Sergeant Miller, a man hardened by years on the force, approached the scene with a practiced weariness. He'd seen it all: domestic disputes, petty theft, public disturbances. And he'd certainly seen his share of disturbing the peace calls in upscale establishments, often instigated by those who felt their status granted them impunity. He took in the scene a visibly agitated David Trafford, red-faced and puffing out his chest, pointing dramatically at Eleanor, who stood remarkably still, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around her. The red handprint on her cheek, however, was impossible to ignore. "All right, ma'am, sir, what's going on here?" Sergeant Miller's voice was firm, yet impartial. David Trafford, regaining his bluster, stepped forward, his voice dripping with indignation. "Officer, this woman, Ms. Johnson. She's been harassing my staff for days. She's causing a disturbance, refusing to leave. And now she's resisting arrest. She needs to be removed." Eleanor, her eyes holding Sergeant Miller's, spoke calmly, her voice cutting through David Trafford's histrionics. "Sergeant, if I may have a moment, I believe there's a vital piece of information you need before you proceed." Her tone wasn't demanding, but it carried an undeniable weight, a quiet authority that made the seasoned officer pause. He saw something in her eyes, not defiance, but a deep, unshakable confidence that didn't fit the narrative David Trafford was aggressively selling. He nodded, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "All right, ma'am, let's step aside for a moment." As they moved away from the main commotion, Eleanor reached into her modest tote bag. David Trafford scoffed. "Probably got her social security card and a bus pass. Pathetic." But Eleanor pulled out not a flimsy ID, but a meticulously organized folder. From it, she smoothly extracted 2 documents. One was a driver's license with her real name, Eleanor Vance. The other, a thick, legal-looking contract prominently stamped and dated, identifying her as the sole owner and CEO of Vance Capital, and confirming Vance Capital's recent complete acquisition of Regal Reserve Bank. Sergeant Miller's eyes, which had been scanning the bank lobby, snapped back to the documents. He read Eleanor Vance's name. Then he read the acquisition papers. His jaw, which had been set in a professional line, slowly began to drop. He looked from the documents to the composed woman before him, then back to the shouting David Trafford. A ripple of comprehension, then disbelief, then a dawning horror spread across his face. You own this bank," he murmured the words, barely a whisper. Eleanor offered him a small, knowing smile. "As of last week, Sergeant, my company Vance Capital completed the acquisition. I came in today to experience firsthand the customer service this institution provides." Her gaze hardened, flicking towards David Trafford. "And it seems Mr. Trafford has provided a rather illuminating demonstration." Sergeant Miller snapped to attention, his radio crackling with an urgent, unheard message. He turned back to the security guards who were still awkwardly trying to detain Eleanor. "Release her! Now!" His voice was low, but laced with an undeniable command. The guards, sensing the shift in authority, immediately stepped back, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. David Trafford, still oblivious to the seismic shift, swaggered over, ready to gloat. "What's the holdup? Officer, is she finally going to jail?" Sergeant Miller turned to David Trafford, his expression grim. "Mr. Trafford, I think you're the one with some explaining to do. You just assaulted the CEO of Regal Reserve Bank, and an undercover customer, and a person of color." The words hung in the air, shattering the composure of the entire lobby. David Trafford's face, moments ago, flushed with arrogance, drained of all color. His eyes bulged, his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked from Eleanor, now standing tall and regal, to the acquisition papers clutched in the police officer's hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The swagger evaporated, replaced by a ghastly, sickening dread. He stammered, No, that's impossible. She's just a customer." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice clear and cutting through the stunned silence. Her composure was absolute, a quiet storm of power unleashed. "Mr. Trafford," she said, her voice devoid of anger yet chillingly firm, "it seems you've just assaulted your CEO, and a customer, and a person of color. Your employment with Regal Reserve Bank is terminated effective immediately. Sergeant, I would like to press charges for assault." The shockwave ripped through the bank. Brenda Lewis, who had been peering over a cubicle wall, went ashen. Mr. Harrison, the branch manager, who had always conveniently been too busy to notice the subtle discrimination under his nose, visibly sagged. He tried to stammer out an apology, but Eleanor cut him off, her gaze like ice. "Mr. Harrison, your silence was as loud as his shouts. Your inaction endorsed this culture. Your employment with Regal Reserve Bank is also terminated." She then turned her attention to Brenda Lewis. "Ms. Lewis, your procedures were thinly veiled prejudice. You are also terminated." The cameras on the bystanders' phones, initially recording injustice, now captured the shocking, unbelievable twist. The murmurs turned into gasps, then disbelieving whispers, followed by scattered applause from some and stunned silence from others. The video would explode, not just for the assault, but for the unprecedented poetic justice of the reveal. Eleanor, now standing at the very center of the lobby, turned to face the mesmerized crowd. The initial shock began to give way to a palpable sense of awe and a quiet building wave of validation. "This isn't just about one man's aggression," she declared, her voice resonating with newfound power. "This is about a system that for too long has denied opportunity, suppressed dreams, and inflicted silent wounds on generations of people just like my grandmother. Today that system begins to crumble brick by painful brick. This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a transformation. We are not just changing management. We are changing the very soul of this institution." And the lesson was clear. Power isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's about the ability to wield that wealth to dismantle corrupt structures and create systemic change. Sometimes the most profound justice comes not from a shouted argument, but from a quiet strategic takeover, flipping the script and reclaiming power from within. The unveiling was complete. Now the rebuilding would begin. The dust, or rather the fragments of old prejudice, began to settle. Regal Reserve Bank, once a symbol of exclusionary power, closed its doors for 2 weeks, not for renovation, but for a complete spiritual and structural overhaul. Eleanor Vance wasn't just firing individuals. She was dismantling a broken system brick by painful brick, and rebuilding it with the very essence of equity and inclusion. The news of the Undercover CEO had exploded across every major news outlet, sparking national conversations about systemic bias in financial institutions. The world watched, waiting to see if this was just a fleeting moment of poetic justice or the dawn of true, lasting change. Eleanor didn't waste a single moment. She brought in a new leadership team, a vibrant mosaic of talent reflecting the diverse communities Regal Reserve was meant to serve. Experience was still valued, but it was no longer privileged above lived experience. The invaluable understanding that came from navigating a world often designed against you. Every hiring committee now included members from different departments, backgrounds, and perspectives, meticulously designed to minimize the unconscious bias that had previously maintained homogeneity. The existing employees who remained, those who hadn't actively participated in the discrimination but had passively observed it, were put through rigorous mandatory training. This wasn't a dry corporate slideshow. It was a deeply immersive series of workshops on the history of financial discrimination in America, the insidious psychological mechanisms of unconscious bias, and practical hands-on methods for ensuring equitable service. Eleanor personally oversaw some of these sessions, sharing stories not just from her grandmother, but from countless individuals who had faced similar struggles. It was uncomfortable, often confronting, but it was necessary to unlearn decades of ingrained prejudice and to build empathy. 6 months later, the transformation was not just evident, it was palpable. Regal Reserve reopened its doors, no longer a cold, imposing fortress, but a warm, welcoming hub of opportunity. The gleaming marble still existed, but it was now softened by vibrant artwork from local artists, and the hushed, exclusive atmosphere had been replaced by a genuine hum of activity and respectful engagement. Eleanor walked through the transformed space, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. She observed interactions that would have been improbable, if not outright impossible, just half a year earlier. In a comfortable consultation area, an elderly black woman in modest but neat clothing was receiving detailed investment advice from a personal banker. This same banker, Eleanor noted, had maintained the exact same respectful attention and patient demeanor he had shown the impeccably dressed wealthy white businessman he had assisted just before her. There were no hushed tones, no hurried explanations, no subtle steering towards simpler, less profitable services. This was true, unwavering equality in action. Then, at a different desk, Eleanor saw Maria Sanchez. Maria, a young Latina entrepreneur with sparkling eyes and a dream as bright as her handmade eco-friendly soaps, was discussing business loan options. Eleanor remembered Maria's story, how she'd been rejected by countless banks, including the old Regal Reserve, because her business was located in a high-risk zip code. a coded term for a low-income, predominantly minority neighborhood. Now, a young empathetic loan officer, a recent hire who had himself experienced similar barriers, guided Maria through the application process with genuine enthusiasm. There were no excessive documentation requirements, no arbitrary questions, no artificial barriers. Maria's smile as she signed the preliminary papers was a beacon of pure, unadulterated hope. It was the smile Eleanor's grandmother had never been given. And at another counter, a South Asian family was opening multiple accounts, their accents thick, their questions earnest. They were met not with suspicion or the demand for extraordinary verification once imposed on customers with similar backgrounds, but with standard identification procedures and a patient, welcoming demeanor. The children, usually shy and intimidated in such formal settings, were even offered small Regal Reserve branded pencils and coloring sheets. Eleanor allowed herself a small, contented smile. The change wasn't just on paper. It was reflected in the respectful gazes, the genuine conversations, the opportunities now flowing freely. It was a testament to the fact that empathy combined with actionable policies could genuinely transform a system. The bank was no longer just about profit. It was about promise. The greatest lesson, Eleanor mused, wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers. It was about proving that true change requires systemic reform, genuine commitment, and a willingness to understand and serve every member of the community, not just the privileged few. Regal Reserve was no longer an echo of injustice. It was a living, breathing testament to equity. And yet Eleanor knew the work was far from over. This was a significant victory. But the journey towards true lasting justice was a long road ahead. Eleanor Vance stood by the large arched window of her new executive office at Regal Reserve, looking out at the Charleston skyline. The city glittered under the setting sun, a familiar landscape that now held new meaning. The bank below hummed with a different kind of energy, one of inclusion, not exclusion. She watched the diverse faces of staff and customers moving with purpose, their interactions marked by mutual respect and a genuine sense of service. In every hopeful smile, in every confident handshake, she saw echoes of Alara May. Her grandmother's spirit, once diminished by a biased system, now bloomed brightly within these very walls. Yet Eleanor knew this was not an endpoint. It was a significant milestone, a powerful victory. But the journey towards true lasting justice was a marathon, not a sprint. The ghost of systemic injustice, though weakened, still lingered in the shadows of society. The intergenerational wealth gap, the deferred dreams, the quiet struggles. These were not erased by a single act of transformation, however monumental. They were wounds that required continuous healing, consistent effort, and unwavering commitment. This truth was often discussed with her son, David Jr. He had been a whirlwind of energy and ideas during the transition, a vital bridge to the younger generation and the community's grassroots efforts. He was now actively involved not just as an advisor, but as the head of a new initiative for financial literacy in underserved schools, funded entirely by Regal Reserve. David Jr. represented the next generation, carrying on the fight armed not just with passion, but with the institutional power and influence his mother had painstakingly created. "Mom," he'd often say, "you opened the door, but we have to make sure everyone knows how to walk through it and that no one can ever close it again." Eleanor smiled, remembering his words. That was the broader message, the deeper lesson. One person's courage, fueled by deep-seated motivation, could indeed ignite a movement. Her undercover mission, the slap heard around the world, had ripped open a curtain. But true transformation required collective effort and sustained commitment. It wasn't enough to just dismantle the old. You had to meticulously, passionately build the new brick by equitable brick. The story of Regal Reserve was becoming a beacon not just for Charleston, but for communities nationwide. It proved that fairness, equity, and genuine opportunity were not just lofty ideals, but achievable realities through unwavering dedication and strategic action. This was the quiet power of real change, not just punishing the wrongdoers, but proving that by owning the narrative, by reclaiming the space, and by intentionally fostering an environment of justice, you could rewrite the rules. Eleanor thought of her grandmother one last time, a gentle ache in her chest that was now mingled with triumph. Alara May hadn't seen this day, but her struggle had carved the path. And in a profound sense, Eleanor knew Alara May had won. Her legacy wasn't just a dream deferred. It was a dream finally realized, expanded, and shared with countless others. The journey for justice is long, Eleanor knew. It is often fraught with challenges, setbacks, and moments of despair. But every step forward, however small, builds a path towards a more equitable future. And sometimes the most profound revenge, the most satisfying victory, is simply building something so undeniably good, so profoundly inclusive, that the old ways simply wither in its light. And so the story of Eleanor Vance and Regal Reserve Bank comes to a close, at least for now. But what about your story? Perhaps you've been denied, overlooked, or underestimated. Perhaps you've walked into a room where you immediately felt judged, dismissed, or simply unseen. Maybe you carry the echo of a loved one's struggle, a story of injustice that fuels your own quiet fire, just like Eleanor Vance carried the weight of Alara May's deferred dream. Know this: your experiences are valid, your voice matters, and your resilience is your greatest power. The world is full of unseen walls, subtle biases, and systemic hurdles. But like Eleanor, you have the capacity to recognize them, to challenge them, and to ultimately topple them. The journey for justice is long and often arduous. It requires courage, conviction, and sometimes the quiet strategic patience of an Eleanor Vance. It might not always involve owning a bank or a dramatic public reveal. Sometimes it's in speaking up in a meeting, challenging a microaggression, supporting a local business, or simply telling your truth. Every single act, big or small, contributes to the dismantling of old systems and the building of new, more equitable ones. The story of Eleanor Vance is a powerful reminder that while the road may be long and fraught with challenges, courage, conviction, and strategic action can indeed turn the tide of injustice. Your story of overcoming adversity, your fight for what's right, your unwavering belief in a better future, these are not just personal narratives. They are powerful catalysts for change, just as hers was. They inspire, they empower, and they illuminate the path for others. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something within you, then don't let the feeling fade. Share it. Talk about it. Let us know in the comments how you've faced adversity and emerged stronger, how you found your voice, or how you're working to build a more just world around you. Your voice, your story, your power. They are invaluable. And if you're hungry for more stories that illuminate, inspire, and empower, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here we believe every struggle holds a lesson, and every voice deserves to be heard. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.